Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad that you're here for the third webinar in Coastal Community Foundation and Social Venture Partner Charleston's LEAD Capacity Building Series for nonprofits. LEAD stands for Learn, Engage, Advance, and Deliver. And that's exactly what we intend to do this morning as it relates to virtual fundraising. And I'm really so pleased to have such a great panel to share all of their expertise with you guys. My colleague, Melissa Levesque, who is the Vice President of Development and Stewardship for the Foundation, as well as Kayla Hammond, who is the Grants and Compliance Manager. And then we have SVP Incoming Advisory Board Chair, Ian Devine, and all around marketing guru, nonprofit genius, John Yerian of We Are Outline, who's been a big contributor to the community. So you guys are in for a big treat today. Please make sure that you complete the survey at the end, that you ask questions, raise your hand, use the question box, the chat function, etc., because all three of these amazing presenters have a lot of knowledge to share with you and are eager to do so. So all that said, Melissa, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, terrific. Well, I am thrilled to be here with everyone and to talk about virtual fundraising. And virtual fundraising has different meanings now after in our new normal for the time being. I wanted to just give an overview of what I'm going to speak about. This presentation is also going to be available to everyone after our meeting. The first thing is talking about what's the landscape of fundraising in 2020? What do we know in terms of seeing trends? The second is looking at the CARES Act and some legislation in Congress because there are some incentives for charitable giving, and I want to make sure everybody knows about those. Then going into what does virtual fundraising mean now, and how does it apply specifically to annual gifts, major gifts, our interaction with professional advisors, which is very important, and donor education and events, because we need to have programming and contact with our donors that isn't exclusively solicitation as well. And final thoughts, I'm also going to talk about the importance of storytelling, which can be extremely powerful in all times, but definitely even more so now. So for fundraising in 2020, what do we know? Well, first, we know that this has been an unusual and extraordinary year. We have seen a global pandemic, we have social justice and racial disparities, economic jumps and starts. Depending where you are, you might have murder hornets, and we have Saharan storms. So, you know, lots of things going on. And it's easy to think about the negative, but there's also some really good things that are happening as well. There was an article that was recently published in the New York Times, and when you look at how philanthropy and donors have responded to the pandemic and compare that to the 2008 recession and the months immediately following the September 11th terrorist attacks, giving has actually eclipsed what giving had been during those two situations. So that is encouraging. Donors are giving more. Also, there are two studies that have been put together, one by Fidelity Charitable and the other by a consortium of community foundations from around the country. And one thing that has come through is that donor advised funds are actually giving more money as well. It's estimated that they're giving 28% more in grant dollars than they did at this time in the prior year. So giving is definitely seeing an uptick. The other thing to think about is, you know, we've had a bumpy stock market, especially since March. But for a lot of portfolios, many as of May have started to recoup and be at the same level they had been at 12/31 of the prior year. So a lot of those losses have come back. The other thing to consider as well is that there are donors who have had a significant amount of market appreciation with the 10-year bull market. So there are still individuals that transferring gifts of assets, appreciated assets is something that is tax-wise, and they have the capability of doing so. The other part I wanted to make sure everybody knew about was why we should care about the CARES Act. The CARES Act was part of the legislation that included different incentives to stimulate the economy. It included the Paycheck Protection Program and other items, but there were also 3 specific incentives for charitable giving. The first that's very important is that gifts of cash normally have a limit on someone's adjusted gross income in terms of how much they can deduct in that one tax year. It's usually 60%. For this year only, that limitation has gone up to 100%. So the federal government is absolutely trying to encourage and incentivize cash giving, outright gifts right now. So that's an important thing for all of us to know. The second is that for corporations normally have a 10% limit on deductions for their charitable giving. That's been bumped up to 25%. And I think you can see that a lot of financial service institutions, other groups are increasing their amount of corporate giving in related to COVID and other issues. And there's some tax underpinnings that encourages that, as well as a moral impulse as well. The last part is the CARES Act provides that non-itemizers, which are the majority of tax filers now, can give up to $300 to charity as an above-the-line deduction on their taxes. So if you're not itemizing, you can still deduct up to $300. That's current law. Now, the reality is $300 is not that much, but there is currently legislation pending in Congress that would raise that limitation to $4,000 for individuals and just over $8,000 for married couples. So I would encourage everyone to set up a Google alert and keep track of that legislation, because it can be very powerful as we get closer to the end of the year. So for virtual fundraising, what is it? I think if we talked about this a year ago, we would be talking about online giving, text to give, how we do things with websites, viral fundraising challenges. Everybody remembers the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Those were the traditional ways we thought about virtual fundraising. The reality is post March 13th, everything is virtual fundraising. And it really includes everything from a meeting standpoint that you previously attended physically and now you're attending virtually. This is a virtual capacity building program. It was originally supposed to be in person. The same thing will take effect with meetings with our donors. So thinking about fundraising in terms of annual gifts, and this is kind of the big pool of donors that we all work with. Looking at some keys to success, one of the things I would do is, if your CRM and database allow it, please try to segment your donors so that you're providing really concise, clear messaging on what matters most to them. So for example, you can have your overarching message of what's going on, but if you have multiple programs and you have 30% of your donors that are really passionate about one program, I would have a segmented email for that 30%, and likewise for the others. One of the nice parts about it is a lot of CRMs provide auto journal entries, so you can track this in your database and see how these messages are resonating. The other thing to think about, and I learned this through the School of Hard Knocks, is write your email messages for smartphone users. I had a donor say to me, and this was a couple of years ago, it's like, your emails are great, but I click on email when I'm on my iPhone. And if it's more than 2 thumb swipes, I just don't have the time to read it. And so I would just encourage you, as you're drafting your messages, test and see what it looks like on a smartphone, because that's how most people are reading it. And you want to make sure that you're engaging them. And you can do that. One question is donor segmentation. Is it complicated? I would say no. It's really about knowing what your donors are most interested in and just crafting a message that is significant for them. And if anybody wants to communicate with me offline about it, I'd be happy to talk about how you can do this in your database, because most CRMs can make this user-friendly for you. Some other keys is when you're doing your emails, especially if you do it through your CRM, you're going to have the ability to track analytics. And I would not think of this as being big brother-ish, but thinking of it more along the lines of, are you communicating the messages that you want, and are they being received in the way that you'd like them to be received? So for example, it can be as simple as seeing on something as easy as MailChimp, did somebody open up the email? If they opened it up, did they just look at it for 5 seconds? If you have hyperlinks in there, did any of them get clicks? One thing that we found, and I found it, recently, but going back over the past, 10, 20 years, is that there are some donors that you can send great messages electronically, and they're just not email people. They want to talk to you on the phone. Others don't want to talk to you on the phone, and they want to talk to you by email. This is a way that you can kind of verify what those profiles are with people in your database. The other thing that's pretty simple is, make sure your website's designed to receive gifts easily, and communicate often, but make sure you have something informative to say, because there's a lot of, everybody's getting lots of email traffic, so you don't want it to be too much. The other part, and this is where things are different right now in this pandemic, is major gifts. Social distancing means that we can't have lunches and breakfasts the way we used to. So I would say use a combination of phone calls, conversational emails, and face-to-face meetings virtually to stay in touch with your key donors. The other thing is, this is a great opportunity for you to have a joint meeting with your top donors, with your CEO or a member of your board. It's much easier. There's no travel. It's a lot more convenient to have these types of meetings, and they're absolutely worthwhile to do. The other part is using online resources and videos to reach and steward your donors. Anyone with a smartphone can put together a really nice, quick thank you video. It could be from a member of staff. It could be from someone who receives your services. It could be from your board member, just as a very nice personal way to say thank you. The other part, and this goes with education and events, is this is a great opportunity. You can schedule virtual breakfasts or lunch and learns for your donors. It's a great way to be transparent, let your donor base know what your needs are, but also keep them engaged and use virtual platforms to do that. Some people may not want to be part of it, but most of these platforms have a record feature. We're recording our program today, and having that there that you can then send out as an email blast later just provides another touch that's informative and also is being great stewards. The other part that I would have as an overarching goal with all of your fundraising is to be storytellers. Storytelling is very compelling, and it's important. It's even more important now than it's ever been. The one caveat I would make is, when you do your story, is make sure the hero of every story either has to be a donor or it needs to be the community you serve. And I would really emphasize that it's the community you serve and highlight how donors are making that possible. People like to see situations that they can model, and they also like to see the impact of their dollars, and storytelling can be a very compelling way of doing that. The other part is, please don't forget professional advisors. They're a key portion of sort of fundraising outreach. Communicate with them, add them to your email distribution list. You want them to see stories and examples of donors who are doing great work, because those stories can resonate with them, and you want them to see one of their clients in one of those stories as something that they can do in the future. It's also a great time to reach out with them. I can say I have had more luck scheduling meetings with people over the past 2 months virtually, then normally it's a matter of you've got to wait 3 weeks to get on somebody's calendar. People are a little bit more nimble now because you're not traveling back and forth as much. Some final thoughts and recommendations is our last program talked about crisis communications, and one of the best points in there was if you feel like you're over communicating, you're probably doing the right amount. I would say that applies for that applies absolutely. I think it's very important that we let donors know that we're here and that we're doing great work, and we let them know that it's necessary that they stay engaged, and it's vital. The other thing is, please do not be afraid to ask for gifts. As referenced at the very beginning of the presentation, is donors are giving at a higher level than they did coming out of the 2008 recession and out of the September 11th terrorist attacks. Obviously, there are certain donor demographics that have been significantly hindered in the economic situation right now, but there are others that are not. And for those that you know that aren't, I encourage you to ask them for gifts, because if you're not, I'm pretty sure another nonprofit will be, and you want to make sure that you're top of mind. And lastly, take advantage of the virtual reality of 2020 for your benefit. Be compelling storytellers and provide great information and an ability to be present, but also to listen to what your donors are most concerned about, what they see is challenges and curiosities. This is a great opportunity for you to really enhance donor relationships and steward them. So some may give more now, but others will give more later because they remembered how you treated them during a difficult time. And there's a big difference between fundraising and development, and you want to develop long-standing relationships. And I would just always keep that top of mind as you're cultivating gifts in these relationships in our 2020 year. So with that, I do have, but I'm going to hold on just for the sake of time. I'm going to share later. There are a couple of links that I'll have that will go to the presentation after this meeting, where they are links on YouTube to several examples of virtual storytelling. One is for, it was a soccer team in Brazil they teamed up to increase organ donations, which it's a great campaign. The other is a really powerful virtual story that was done by the Anti-Defamation League. But they're good examples of how you can be compelling without directly asking as well. So with that, I am going to pass this on and would be happy to answer any questions you have as well.
Are there questions? Is it me?
Yeah.
It's me. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with everybody. My name is John. I'm managing partner at Outline, a creative agency in Charleston. You can find us at weareoutline.com. That's spelled exactly like you think it is. And I have a few comments that I'm going to go through pretty quickly, so we don't completely crowd Ian off the panel as time shrinks. But if anybody on here would like to follow up with me to talk in more detail, that's perfectly fine. That's totally okay and available at no charge. So if you want to email me, I'm john@weareoutline.com. And what I want to do is go quickly at a high level over the pieces that would put you in a successful position to virtual fundraise. And before I go any further, I want to say that virtual fundraising is just fundraising. It's just fundraising. If in your head or in your organization you have some distinction, or the way you fund or plan it has it like it's different, that's really where I would start. And one thing that we've noticed with nonprofits we work with and in the community we move through is that the pandemic and quarantine have really exposed how some organizations have relied on personalities instead of process. They have ways of fundraising that aren't truly coordinated or process oriented. They're not orchestrated as part of a really purposeful effort. And they've seen a lot of difficulties because they can't just do things the way they used to. Virtual fundraising is just fundraising. It just demands coordination and consideration and resource allocation. And that brings me to my very first point, which is successful virtual fundraising, to me, begins with creating a commitment to a culture of communication. Most nonprofits we work with have a culture of mission delivery, and that's awesome. But they often ignore or set aside their responsibility, and I did use that word, to communicate and articulate, to let people know what they're up to and why it matters. And we have a bunch of great fundraisers. I can't see any of you. I'm staring at us, the panel, but I know you're out there. We have a bunch of great fundraisers on this call. In fact, if we flipped it around, we could learn a lot from you. And one of the ways I know you're great fundraisers is some of you are raising funds despite really, really suboptimal websites, brands, communications models. You are overcoming all of that, right? You're producing funding from an environment that's not really setting you up to succeed. And if we've got 40 some odd people with us today, like statistically, I'm talking to like 20, and you know who you are. And when I talk about a culture, like creating a culture of communication, what I really mean is setting your fundraising or your fundraiser up for success and not putting so much pressure on them to pull a rabbit out of the hat. That funding call, that interaction should be part of a chain, a sequence of activities and touches that's advancing somebody in a state of readiness to connect with you. And your job would be more about conversion than like re-explaining what your organization does or fighting back confusion. Committing to being an organization that communicates means it gets talked about at the highest levels, it's funded, it's prioritized, it's something that you do. It's not just something that one of the people at the organization does, or you do, you know, when you have time. So having achieved that commitment or some level of it to communication, when we start with nonprofits, really we kind of think about the Hippocratic Oath, which you might be familiar with, which first do no harm. This is what doctors swear to do upon graduation. So organizations should really look around and consider whether or not anything in their external presentation is like harmful. And by that, I would describe a name for an organization that's confusing or inexact. We rename 2 to 5 organizations a year because they just outgrew their name. And you know who you are because some of you on the call have to like decode your name to donor prospects all the time. And that's not a good start. Websites that are outdated, that lack functionality, brands that are aesthetically just like a mess. It is much, much more expensive to talk somebody back into being interested in you than it is to just find a new friend. It's like really costly. Confusion is a lot worse than ignorance. I would rather somebody didn't know a thing than thought I was doing something I'm not doing. So the very first step in your culture of communications is to identify and work to change things that are creating harm. And as strange as it may sound from like the website guy, marketing guy, I would rather see a blank page than a blog post from 4 years ago. You know, like get that stuff out of there and get yourself down to baseline 0 of things that are accurate or look good. Once you've eliminated the harm, step 1, you're ready to clean up and get dressed. That means a real consideration of your external presentation, your brand identity. It's really not any different than how you would dress yourself to go to a job interview. And some of you are raising funds despite the fact that probably not your fault, but you're showing up to job interviews in like a stained sweatsuit, and it's incredible. It's a credit to you. Really, really unsuccessful, cheap, and frankly ugly brand identities, logos, color palettes, and websites are problematic. You're competing for somebody's attention. They're having wonderful experiences on the web. When they get to you, if it looks bad, they're going to make assumptions. And this is where I remind people, and Ian can agree or disagree with this now or later, but whether they admit it or not, most donors really like to see some evidence of prior investment. They don't always want to be the first one in the pool. So the snazzier you look, the more likely they are to feel affirmed in their choice that other smart people have invested in you. Even if you have to do some creative stuff with the budget to plus up your presentation, it makes a big difference to donors who want to be able to point at the website and be proud of what they're giving to, because it looks like it's on its way to something great. So step 2 is clean up and get dressed. And then step 3, we call walk and talk. If you're doing no harm and you started to look good, your presentation is mostly together. This is where engagement can become more realistic. This gets back to storytelling, which was mentioned a moment ago. This is where you can start to deploy communications through these assets and really clearly articulate what you're doing or how you're doing it. That could take a million different forms. And I would insert here parenthetically that it's on webinars exactly like this, where you hear people like us talk about how easy it is to do something, how it's free, how, shouldn't you just because you can't do something doesn't mean you should. You can absolutely shoot a video with your iPhone. You should really think about that for a hot second and how it's going to turn out and whether or not you have the bandwidth. And as part of your commitment to communication, have a commitment to quality, and that what you're going to share is meaningful, it's going to be professionally presented and well considered, and that you're going to be thoughtful about where you spend your most precious resource, which is your time. Usually not a ton of time to produce that stuff. So as you walk and talk, and now we're starting to think about organizations that are a little bit larger and probably have a bigger operating budget, slightly bigger staff, you move into this fourth phase, which is building relationships. So that's where your communication becomes truly two-way, where you're accepting like feedback, subscription, right, comment, and you're returning, and you're using these platforms, your external presentation, to actually cultivate and advance relationships. These should turn into like real in-person relationships. And this is the end of that cycle that would really serve the fundraising we started out from. So just to recap, because I went through that super fast. We really encourage nonprofits to commit to a culture of communications. Take it as seriously as you take the other stuff you're really committed to. Look around and make a plan, get to work fixing the things that are doing harm, that are creating confusion. Clean up, look better, you know who you are. Some of you have amazing, beautiful websites and logos. Some of you, it's like struggle, and it matters a lot. Clean it up and make that presentation beautiful. From there, you can walk and talk. You can start to produce videos, get active on social, push out an e-newsletter and engage. And then out of that, you can really start to build relationships. And that to me is sort of the virtuous cycle that would lead to fundraising, virtual or otherwise, all built from these tools in your possession. So I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions, or if I should just hand it over to the next panelist.
Don, it looks like there are 2 questions. One is, how many touches are required to reach someone in a culture of communication?
There are a few, I think the answer is supposed to be like 8 or 10. I would tell you it has more to do with the quality of the touch. It could be 300 if it's careless or poorly considered. It could be 3 if it's done better. The point I would emphasize is less, a sense of number of touches, but for everyone to start to harvest and track data that would help you get to your answer, that would help you get to a cost of conversion. For us, it typically looks like website visitation. We want to look at duration of that visit to make sure our content is successful and appealing. That should lead to engagement, like subscribing to something or liking on Facebook. Out of that, you start to see contact, and from that, you should get moved into like a fundraising list for follow-up. That was kind of a rambling answer. You know, somewhere between 3 and 10.
Okay, of quality. And then the next question, how do you reconcile the cost of looking good with donors who are concerned about overhead? It's a great question because overhead myth, reality resonates, I'm sure, with a lot of people on this webinar today.
Yeah, and I get wound up about it. I love to get in board meetings and just yell at people, frankly, who came to that board meeting in expensive suits and drive nice cars and live in beautiful homes. It's no different. It's the same. Like it is really, really important to present and articulate and put forward what you're doing as an organization in a way that serves our aim, which is, by the way, growing and attracting more people. That's the goal here. So having some consideration around how it looks is no different than a business or anybody else who's in the, and this is where you can challenge a board. Like, you really need to get clear. Are we here to evangelize? Like, are we making every decision and consideration from a growth mindset? Are we on offense or are we playing defense? Are we worried about the constituency we already have and afraid to ruffle feathers and don't really think we're going to grow? That's confrontational. That's a little bit tough. But that's one thing to get clear on is like, we're talking about going out to raise a whole bunch more money. So why are you worried about the money for this? Isn't that, sometimes that can bring the room to a halt a little bit.
Yeah.
John, you may have just gotten yourself a job going around to boards and being a guest speaker to challenge them on their growth mindset.
Yep, happy to.
The only thing that I'd like to add, and just thank you to what John said, is another way to think about it is when you're trying to make sure you have a very professional, polished face, public face, communications face for your organization. One of the things to think about in making an argument with your staff leadership as well as your board is looking at your mission and your strategy on where you need to grow and what you want to do. There are two audiences that are going to get you there. One is by growing the amount of dollars that come from your current donor base, and that's usually not going to get you there. And the second means you got to find more donors. And the way you get more donors, 20% of it's going to be word of mouth, and 80% of it is going to be more general public awareness because people see you communicating and having a more vigorous public presence. So I would look at it within that context because if people don't know who you are, and from a staff standpoint, it's too expensive to keep adding staff people, you're going to have to up your communications budget to do that. So that's sort of the experience that we've had.
Great point, Melissa. So now's a great segue for you, Kayla, to talk about grants and how people can elevate their grant application to get more funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me today. I'm Kayla Hammond. I'm the Program and Compliance Manager here at the Foundation. I've been here for 4.5 years now, I guess. So to start off with just a couple things that make applications really stand out to us. The first thing I would say is, we've talked a lot about storytelling today and the importance of that, and it absolutely is important in grant applications as well. I would just add to that the stories do need to be backed up by data, and that needs to be shared. The best grant applications we see are a good mix of the two. Our colleague Helen always tells a story of a donor couple that she met with, and one of the spouses only cared about stories, only wanted to hear all the wonderful things that had happened for these children. The other spouse only cared about the data. He didn't care if there were fluffy stories, just tell me like the hard data, what do you have that backs this up? So it really needs to be a good combination of those two. They serve different purposes. The storytelling really helps the committee or the donor understand what it is you really do, because if they can't see it face to face, especially right now, those stories bring it to life, but you've got to have the data to back up. This is why we're doing it. It doesn't necessarily have to be your own, is what I would say, especially for small nonprofits who may not have had either the length of time or just the capacity to build up their own data sets, there's plenty of national data that you can pull from. So if you're a reading nonprofit, pull from that data about national statistics or statewide statistics. Ideally, you'll have your own to back up your own programs. And if you don't have that yet, I would highly encourage you to start building that up. But if you're not there yet, there are still data sources you can pull from. So I said that's the first thing that really makes an application stand out, is having that balance of those two kind of pieces there. The second thing I would say is apply for what you actually need, not necessarily what you think the funder or the donor is maybe looking for. It's generally really easy to tell if this is something that's really important to you, or if it's just kind of like something, well, yeah, I guess that fits, you know, we'll apply for that. This is also a really good time for that. I will say one of the benefits of this crazy year that we've had is that a lot of funders are spending time thinking about how they can be more accessible to nonprofits and how they can be more flexible during this time. This is a really good time to start moving in that kind of general operations direction, asking for capacity building support. Funders are all taking a look right now at what they can be doing differently to help. So that's a good thing that's coming out of this that hopefully will stick around. You know, we just talked a little bit about the cost of looking good and the cost of communications and all of that. If that's what you need, then that's what you should apply for. The best applications are for something that you really and truly need, because it does shine through. That's what people tend to write best about, is what's actually important to them and what they really need right now. The other thing I would say is write your application to be targeted to the mission of the fund. And I want to be clear that I don't mean spin your mission to fit something that is not in your mission. But for example, we have a fund that supports education for underserved communities. We have nonprofits who apply who serve all communities. You know, they serve any school that wants to come. It doesn't have to be Title I. That's absolutely great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if the fund is specifically for underserved communities, talk specifically in your application about the pieces of your program that serve that population. You want to have that key information in there, because otherwise it's not always clear that it's the best fit. Doesn't mean you should talk about things you don't do. You shouldn't be inventing programs to fit, but you can highlight the parts of your program that best fit with that program's mission. The next thing I'd say is just stay on topic. So if you're applying for a specific program, there's one thing you want to get off the ground. The bulk of your application should be about that program. We have applications sometimes that come in that spend, you know, a lot of time talking about all the different great stuff that they do, and they apply for one piece of that, but that piece only got 2 or 3 sentences. It's great to talk about an overview. We do want to know what your organization does overall. You know, it's great to mention other programs you have, but what the committee wants is a solid understanding of the program you're applying for, so the bulk of your application should really be targeted there. The last thing I'll say in this piece, because I know we want to stay on track, is that if it's clear that the organization took time on the application, that can really elevate it. And I don't necessarily mean it's the longest application we get, because length does not always equal quality. But what I mean by that is it was proofread. That's a really small thing that can really hurt an application, is if you have lots of typos in it. It's hard on a computer sometimes, so we recommend, if you don't have anyone else around who can read it, because that's usually our first suggestion, is give it to somebody else. Laura and I all the time email each other documents to proofread, because it's just easier to see when somebody else has their eyes on it. If you can't do that, print it out, just take a minute and look at it, because that's a really small thing that can make a difference. It also means that, it has enough content to it. If it's a 1,000-word limit and you have 20 words, it doesn't look like you really took the time. So just make sure there's enough there to really get your points across. So from there, I'll kind of shift a little bit to virtual site visits. I do see a question in the chat box about, do most funders make data-driven decisions? And what I would say is that it's not the only decision maker, but it is a piece of it. It depends from committee to committee kind of what their priorities are, but almost all committees are going to consider the data in their decision making. So it shouldn't be the sole determination, but it is a factor for almost all funders. I will say for our competitive programs, we have a rubric that we use to make sure that we're really assessing applications in an objective way. That rubric is something that we've posted publicly and we're happy to share. I was a teacher in my last life and I'm really big on people should know what they're being measured on. It's really hard to meet a standard that you don't know what it is. So it's worth asking a funder, you know, are you able to share what you're going to be judging these applications on? They may say no, and that's fine. But that's something that, you know, we're willing to share publicly, so it's certainly worth asking. But I will say data is generally one of the criteria that's considered.
And
then
someone
question
find
about-
the rubric. Yeah.
Yes. So we posted it online, but I will say it was probably 2 years ago now. The quickest way is probably just to email the person who's in charge of it, but it is a blog on our website. I think we have a search feature on our website now, so if you go in there and search, you might be able to find it. But if not, I'm happy to send it to you. I don't know if our contact information is in here, but it is on our website.
Yeah,
So
it'll be in the fall where we send out.
Perfect, yeah. So you're welcome to email me. I'm happy to share it. The next thing I'll kind of go into just for a minute here is virtual site visits. That's something that, of course, is new to most of us. We had a program this spring that I was halfway through when COVID hit. So we had half of them were in-person site visits, and the nonprofits had to really quickly pivot to virtual site visits. So a couple things that I would just mention. The first is logistical, but test the technology if at all possible. You know, we did a test call before this just to make sure everything worked. A lot of program officers are going to be willing to test it if you ask. If you're not comfortable with technology or if it's one you've never used before, it's worth asking to say, hey, do you mind if we just connect really quick to make sure that my technology works? The second thing I would say is, of course, make sure you have good Wi-Fi wherever you are, that it's quiet enough. And then the next piece I would say is having a visual aid was really helpful. When we did the virtual site visits, the ones that went best, I think, were ones that had something to share on the screen and just something to share in general. A lot of our normal in-person site visits, the first part of it is usually a tour. We go see the programs in action. There's that piece of the site visit that you can't do virtually. You know, it's really hard to give us a tour of your facility or to show us the programs happening. So if you can show us something, I think that really helps kind of build out the site visit a little bit. Either a video of programming is great if you have that, so you can still see the programming in action, or just a PowerPoint with some of the information that you typically would have shown us can be really useful. And then the last thing I would say before I pass it off is just, you know, we talked about communication and we've talked about storytelling, and time is often kind of the mitigating factor there that makes it difficult. Virtual site visits tend to be shorter than in-person site visits because they don't have that tour, because they don't have the walking around and seeing the programming. So this is a good time to share those stories. So I would come prepared with just a couple success stories, a couple stories that show what you're doing, because you're probably going to have the time. So that's a really good opportunity to share those stories that you couldn't fit in the character limited application, but you do have the chance to share now. So I would say that's a really good opportunity for those. So with that, I'll kind of wrap up here unless there are any other questions, and then I'll pass it on to Ian.
Thank you, Kayla. I don't see any questions. So Ian?
Thank you, Lara. Well, I'm wearing several hats today. So I'm speaking to you as incoming head of SVP, which is part of the Coastal Community Foundation. It's a grant-making organization. I'm also head of a foundation that focuses on elder abuse. That's a grant-making organization. And thirdly, I'm the head of a small local land trust, which is a fundraising organization. And by the way, I've learned some good things on this call today that I'm going to use. But for the past few years, I've been telling nonprofits that you have to focus on the value you provide. You have to justify yourself every day, every interaction with a potential donor or your board. You have to justify how you're advancing the mission. And that's even that's made more difficult by the COVID pandemic. I think when you're talking about how COVID has affected you in your fundraising messages, you have to talk first about how it's affecting your clients, the community you serve. And then you have to talk about how you have adapted, changed to continue serving them. And that's the message strategy you should focus on. What you should not talk about is how terrible COVID has been for you and has cut your fundraising and has cut you off from your clients. Everybody is in the same boat, and I think you need to focus on how you're adapting. A couple of examples. I think for the elder abuse aspect, one of our grantees came to us. I reached out to them and said, "How you doing?" And they came back to me with the story that COVID now has cut off the connection between them and their elderly clients whom they serve at home. So they said, here's how we've changed. Now we go to the front door, we can't go inside the house anymore. But we leave a package on the front step. We have visual communication, sometimes words through the window. And that just shows that they've adapted. They've been able to roll with it. And their clients still are getting the benefit. For the land trust, it actually, COVID turned out to be an advantage. People were shut in their houses, locked down, were getting frustrated and mad. One of the few releases they had, besides binge watching Netflix, is getting outside and walking on trails. Yes, you can walk 6 feet apart with a group of people. The land trust accidentally provided a great source of relief and release and spiritual calmness in a very frustrating time. Now, we've put our fundraising on hold, but we're going to use that when we do go out. We're going to use that message of we were there for the community when you needed us. So that's sort of two types of messages that you want to be able to convey. I would, switching back to what Melissa said earlier, I would endorse virtual one-on-ones. This takes advantage of the 80-20 rule. 80% of your money is going to come from 20% of your donors. I would start with your board. If you're not comfortable, do one-on-ones with your board. There's a friendly audience. You give them updates. Keep it short, keep it information packed. And then you can, when you're comfortable with that, go on to your major donors. Talk about how your clients have been affected and what you're doing to serve them. I would also think that it would be very good to talk about partners that you're working with, other organizations who can fill gaps. Everybody likes to see partnership in the not-for-profit world, and if adding the right partner can help you meet your mission or actually improve your mission, then by all means do it and use it. We have to think about what you're doing beyond COVID and how your strategy of operating right now is going to translate hopefully next year into a more more normal time, but you may be able to increase your virtual presence with clients and donors and expand upon that. That part is here to stay. That's it. And then just in presentations like this, here's what I do. I have my computer sitting on 4 boxes of jigsaw puzzles, so it's up. My head is near the top of the screen. I have good lighting. I make a rookie mistake when I'm doing one-on-ones, is looking at the image of the person I'm talking to instead of at the camera. But those are just little tips on how to be more effective in one-on-ones that may help you. That's it. Any questions here?
Ian, there are a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, I think, is geared to you, which is, well, what do you think the most effective way to reach a donor virtually? Video, email, or a one-on-one meeting?
I think it's a combination. For that 80% that gives 20%, periodic information-filled emails, constant contact, just short updates with a positive message and a link to your donation page. For the 20% that give 80% of your funds, definitely reach out to them, set up in a virtual meeting or a phone call if they're more comfortable that way, and just again give them the update, short, and let them guide. And now they will understand that an ask is going to be part of this, but they're already committed to you. They want to find out what's going on. They're interested in you, so, and they like you, so just build on that.
Ian, if I could just jump in, I would encourage everyone to take advantage of boredom and technology. You've got funders that are accustomed to doing things. They're accustomed to getting things done and being busy and successful, and they're dying of cabin fever. And you can get a Zoom meeting with people that you would not have gotten a meeting with a year ago, 100%. You can do it. So, and this applies in the corporate world. We have clients who are getting in front of VCs they wouldn't have gotten a whiff at a year ago, because these guys are going bananas and they want to do stuff. So tap into that energy, share a Zoom link that's as close as you can get, and get them excited, and do everything Ian said, follow up, put them in the communication feed. But I'd say, take advantage of meeting hard to find people like Ian in his beautiful library or wherever he is. Just get him on the screen.
Well, the next question seems to be a combination for, I think, Kayla, Melissa, and maybe you, Ian, which is how can nonprofits get in front of wealth managers and donors with funds at the foundation?
Sure. I don't mind taking that first. One of the things, and this is a question we hear, frequently, whether we are in a social distancing atmosphere or not. Our donors usually want to have a certain amount of privacy. So one of the things that we encourage all of the nonprofits that we work with to do is certainly happy to meet with you virtually or by phone to learn more about what you're doing. But also, the number one recommendation I have is the same way we're saying communicate. It's fine if you want to add me to your communications distribution list, because one of the things that we do is kind of going back into segmentation. We know what our donor advisors have an interest in funding, partially because we technically write those checks for what they recommend. So we do know what they have an interest in. So what we'll do is, if we get something that's electronic from you, that's an update, and we know that kind of falls within an issue area, that we have a group of advisors that have an interest, then we'll forward that to them. We do not pair our donor advisors with the nonprofits directly. So in that sense, I'll be completely candid. We're not matchmakers, but when we know that there's an interest, we will absolutely quietly try to make sure that they know what you're doing. What I would say on the second half of that is with wealth managers is it's really going to what John and Ian said is this is a really great time to schedule those meetings virtually. They want to have meetings. And I would, it's so easy to just say, I can do a 15-minute Zoom call with you. And, master that share screen feature, have something that is really professional and tight, that's a great story about what you're doing, and make sure that story has someone in there that's a donor that could resemble a potential client of theirs. And, it sounds silly, but practice it multiple times, telling that story, working through your shared screen before you have those meetings. So it's just really tight. But I absolutely encourage everybody to do that. And most are accessible. I've had multiple meetings with professional advisors virtually over the past 2 months.
We have about 4 minutes left, and there's 2 more questions. One is it practical for us to ask our top donors to reach out to their circle of friends?
Yes.
I'm happy. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
I would say if you have a donor that's not willing to give you a referral or be willing to provide a testimonial, that's a donor that I would consider at risk and shaky. And that's not a bad practice to have all the time.
Great. Okay. The next question is, I think for you, John, how important is consistency versus quality with social media?
The answer is quality, and consistency that's noisy is actually harmful. People tune it out. One way to get around this is to think about cultivating individual voices from leaders within your organization on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook to speak as themselves. Organizational channels tend to be deadly boring. They are very risk averse and safe and just kind of like a prescription sedative. Individuals within organizations tend to be interesting. They can speak from their passion in their own voice, use first person pronouns, and be followable. So we typically train individuals. It either sticks or it doesn't. It's either an authentic part of their life or it isn't. But if you get to stick with some of them, your quality is going to go way up, and you'll get out of that kind of just like, why are we even doing this Twitter post? So
to the prior question then, one way for organizations to have their top donors communicate on your behalf, give a testimonial, and reach out to their circle of friends to help recruit new donors would be to use their personal social media feeds. Mm-hmm. Great. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we appreciate everyone who spent time with us this morning. As Melissa said previously, we will send this out to everybody after the presentation. We'll include contact information for John and Kayla and try to find the link to the rubric that was posted on the website previously. If there are other questions, feel free to send them to me and I can get them to any one of our wonderful panelists, all of whom I really appreciate being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope that you guys will join us for our next LEAD program webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.